Welcome back to the Deep Dive. This is Reformed Thinking.
Glad to be here.
We have a really fascinating stack of material that you've sent over today.
Yeah.
It's all centered on the theology of Israel's monarchical era.
Right.
So this is the period, that really kicks off with David, and it's where we see God's idea of governance getting very focused through one specific royal line.
Mm-hmm.
It really does set the stage for everything that follows.
It really does.
Okay, so let's start to unpack this. We're going to get past the broad strokes of God's earlier covenants and really zero in on one pivotal agreement, what we call the Davidic covenant.
That's our mission today. We're going to walk you through these sources, looking at excerpts that really detail the structure of this covenant.
Mm-hmm.
And maybe more to the point, the promised fulfillment as the Old Testament lays it out.
So what it actually means.
Right. We want to understand what the scriptures are actually declaring about the survival of David's line and, the very specific governmental nature of the kingdom that the prophets and the people were expecting.
It's all about the framework God established for earthly rule through a chosen family, a line that was destined to lead to the Messiah.
And to get there, we really do have to start at the beginning, or at least an earlier beginning.
You mean not with David?
Not with David.
Mm.
The sources are pretty clear that the Davidic covenant isn't happening in a vacuum. It's really presented as a continuation, maybe a strategic refinement of a promise God made centuries before.
And you're talking about Abraham.
It has to start with Abraham. He is the necessary starting point if you want to understand Israel's identity, its lineage, and its destiny in God's plan.
Okay, so let's go there. Part one then. The origin of this promise.
And its amplification.
First, the seed promise. The Abrahamic connection.
Right.
The source of these big governmental ideas goes all the way back to Genesis. God promises to bless Abraham, give him an innumerable posterity.
Mm-hmm. A huge family.
A huge family. And this promise, you find it in Genesis 12. It just establishes this massive scope. It's about nation building, but it's also about universal influence.
It's not just a personal blessing for Abraham, not by a long shot. It's about creating a channel, a conduit, through which the whole world would eventually be blessed.
And the key is that this happens through his descendants.
That's the single thread. The promise is focused on the destined descendants. The sources make a very strong case that what we see in Theology 7, the Davidic covenant, is really an amplification of that seed promise.
So it's not replacing it.
Not at all. It's narrowing the trajectory. We go from this broad promise of a huge nation to the very specific promise of a royal dynasty. It's refining who exactly that final descendant is going to be.
I see that. It's like a focusing of the lens. If the Abrahamic promise is the wide-angle shot, a great nation, a blessing for everyone, then the Davidic covenant is the zoom lens.
That's a great way to put it.
It provides the governmental mechanism and the royal identity for that blessing to flow. It's defining the political and regal side of the promised seed. It defines the rule itself.
And that focusing brings us right to the main event for this era, which is the kingdom concept reaching its zenith.
Its high point.
It's its absolute high point. The material we're looking at argues that the idea of a kingdom, which had been, developing since Israel was formed.
With Saul being that kind of tragic false start.
Right. And David being the true founder, it all reaches its definitive high point right here in 2 Samuel 7.
This is the moment of maximum political and, I guess, prophetic weight for the monarchy in the Old Testament.
Think about what David did. He unified the tribes, which were always squabbling. He secured the borders. He brought the Ark of the Covenant to Jerusalem, making it the religious center.
He created a real functioning capital. He secured the physical reality of the kingdom.
But the promise, and this is the key, the promise goes so far beyond David's successful but, temporary rule. The Davidic covenant is looking forward. It's specifically predicting the future worldwide reign of David's greater son, the Messiah.
And that prediction just transforms the whole thing. It becomes the central organizing principle for how you understand the Old Testament's view of the future.
It does. It's not just about keeping a dynasty going for a few hundred years. It's about guaranteeing an eternal royal line that ends with a Messiah who will reign literally, politically, and eternally.
Over the whole earth.
Over the whole earth. The scope just explodes from David's little local territory to universal dominion.
And that sets a permanent standard, doesn't it? Everything that happens to Israel after this, the kingdom splitting in two, the spiritual corruption of the kings, the Babylonian captivity.
All of it.
It's all judged against the perfection of this divine promise. It creates this expectation that only one person, the one true heir, can ever fully satisfy what this rule requires.
And this commitment to a specific lineage, a specific throne, and a specific system of rule is what we have to get into next.
Right.
It's what makes the Davidic covenant so much more than just a deal between a king and his God. It's a declaration of eternal governmental policy.
Okay, so let's dig into that policy.
Yeah.
This brings us right to let's call it the legal language of 2 Samuel 7. This is the heart of the deep dive.
It is.
We've got the 5 specific promises to David that kind of structure the covenant itself, and then we have the 4 defining elements that boil it down to its eternal essence.
Let's walk through those 5 promises. They're both immediate and long-term, and they establish stability for David right away, but also lay the groundwork for that messianic hope.
Okay, promise number 1. It's immediate, it's concrete. God guarantees David that he's going to have a child, Solomon, who isn't even born yet.
Right.
And that he will succeed him and establish his kingdom. So right away, the succession crisis is solved. It stabilizes everything.
Instant continuity. Then second, the promise gives Solomon a very specific job. This son, it says, shall build the temple instead of David.
So he gets this specific, visible, religious, and national role. He's the one who builds the physical center of Israel's worship.
A task David wasn't allowed to do. God prohibited him because of the blood on his hands from all the wars he fought.
Okay, so number 3. This is where we start moving into the eternal scope. The throne of Solomon's kingdom shall be established forever.
And that one word, forever, that's the pivot point. It introduces this idea that this throne, unlike any other dynasty in the ancient world, is guaranteed to continue.
It's an absolute legal claim, even if the guy sitting on it is temporary.
And the 4th promise is, it's maybe the most theologically significant for understanding the nature of this covenant.
Which is?
The throne will not be taken away from Solomon, even though his sins justify chastisement.
That's huge.
Yeah.
It addresses human failure right up front.
It does. It means that while David's descendants can be and will be punished, and punished severely for disobedience,
They can lose the enjoyment of the throne. They can be exiled. They can lose their political power.
all of that. But the covenant itself, the legal right to rule, cannot be canceled because of human sin. This guarantees the legal continuity of the bloodline.
That distinction is just paramount. It means the covenant is, at its core, unconditional in its final fulfillment. Each day-to-day experience of the kings is conditional.
That's it. The source notes that the blessings were promised to continue through Solomon. That means the legal claim to the throne stays intact, preserved through the lineage, even when the nation and its kings are a total mess.
And then the 5th promise just brings it all home. The overarching guarantee. David's house, throne, and kingdom shall be established forever.
It moves right past the individual failures of Solomon or anyone else and guarantees the dynasty itself. The whole royal line and its governmental authority, the political right to rule, is locked into David's family.
So those 5 promises are like the operational clauses.
Yeah.
But the source material, as you said, boils them down even further. It gives us 4 defining elements from 2 Samuel 7.16.
And this is where it gets really interesting, because these 4 elements define the non-negotiable blueprint for the promised kingdom. Let's look at these 4 pillars. They are the essence of the Davidic structure.
Okay, pillar number 1, house. What does the source material say that is?
House refers to the royal dynasty of David. It's a guarantee of a continuing posterity, a bloodline that will not be wiped out.
So it's a family line.
A family line. The promise verified that David's lineage would survive everything thrown at it and would eventually produce the Messiah who would reign over the earth. So house is the legal and biological assurance. It guarantees the legitimacy of the future king. He has to be a real descendant of David. If that line failed, the whole covenant failed.
Got it. Okay, the second element is kingdom. This involves a people and a dominion, a territory for the king to rule over. Now, why is the source so specific about the nature of this kingdom?
Because the source specifically identifies this as a political kingdom. It's the sphere of the king's rulership. And this is a critical point we can't miss.
Why so critical?
In the ancient Near East, a kingdom, just by definition, meant you had territory, you had subjects, and you had a political administration. By using this term, the source argues that the expectation is set from the beginning. The final fulfillment will involve the governance of nations on earth.
A literal functioning government.
A literal functioning government. This isn't just a spiritual idea or a metaphor for a domain in people's hearts. It's a sphere of active, coercive governance.
Okay, I understand the argument for that kind of coherence, but a lot of theological schools would say the New Testament spiritually fulfills these promises through the church. What does the source say that makes this fulfillment require a political earthly throne?
The material really insists on what we'd call hermeneutical coherence. The argument goes like this. If the initial parts of the covenant, like Solomon's rule, were literal,
A literal people, a literal piece of land, a literal army.
right, then the ultimate extension of that same covenant, the Messianic kingdom, has to also be literal. The sources argue that if the promises were only meant to be spiritual, the initial fulfillment wouldn't have been so thoroughly physical and political.
So the start defines the terms for the finish.
It has to. The source would say that the New Testament spiritualizes the experience of the kingdom for believers right now, today, but that doesn't cancel out the promise of a future governmental structure over Israel and the nations.
Which leads us to the third element, throne. This is the seat of that political power we were just talking about.
The throne suggests the authority, the governing strength of the king and his rule. It's about the active function of the sovereign, the one who enforces laws, administers justice, keeps order. If the king is reigning, he's doing it from a throne. The authority is concrete.
And finally, the fourth element, forever. This word just keeps coming in.
It's the duration guarantee. It stresses that the right to rule will never be taken away from the family of David, and the posterity of David will never stop ruling over the house of Israel.
So if you combine all four,
If you combine them, the house, which is the guaranteed lineage, the kingdom, the political sphere of rule, the throne, the governing authority, and the forever, the guaranteed duration, they build an absolute assurance of an eternal earthly monarchy, and it's vested specifically in David's descendants.
and that blueprint is what guides all the prophetic expectation from that point on.
It has to. So even if the initial kings failed and it led to national disaster and exile, the covenant promises themselves didn't fail.
No, the legal right to the throne just stayed alive through the lineage, waiting for the one person, the Messiah, who could finally exercise the full eternal authority that was promised.
And that structure really forces us to talk about fulfillment.
Right. Which our sources present as a pretty straightforward case for consistency. The way the first stage of the covenant looked has to inform how the final stage will look.
Let's start with the initial fulfillment. Solomon. Solomon was, in fact, established on the throne of Israel. He experienced the immediate blessings of the covenant.
He was the son who built the temple. He reigned over a unified, geographically defined kingdom.
And the sources just keep hammering this point home. Solomon's throne was a literal political throne.
He collected taxes, he signed treaties, he administered justice. There was no metaphor there.
None. And if God established a literal king on a literal throne in Jerusalem as the start of the covenant, then the definition of those terms, king and throne, is fixed.
That physical, literal reality of Solomon's rule becomes the pivot point for the argument about the ultimate fulfillment.
It does. And the conclusion that the source draws from this is, well, inescapable within this framework. Because Solomon's throne was literal and political, the ultimate fulfillment through the Messiah will also be literal and political, as well as spiritual, of course.
So if the words kingdom and throne meant a specific physical, political thing for the first phase, we have to assume they mean the same literal governmental thing for the future phase.
It's a matter of divine integrity, really. God doesn't just switch the meaning of his own covenanted terms halfway through. The promise is to rule over Israel and the nations from a throne forever. That rule has to eventually show up in a concrete, governing way to honor the original agreement.
And to really solidify this literal argument, the source points us to God's oath to David in Psalm 89.
Yes. God reiterated the future fulfillment of the Davidic covenant to David, but he did it through an oath.
And raising it to an oath changes the legal status. It's not just a statement of intent anymore.
It's a legal, unchangeable swearing by God himself. It's an absolute guarantee that it will be executed.
So why does making it an oath in Psalm 89 make it legally ironclad in a way a simple declaration doesn't?
Well, an oath, especially when God swears by his own holiness, is the highest possible guarantee of certainty you can get. The sources stress this moves the covenant from just a standard agreement to an unchangeable decree.
And the details of that oath are specific.
Very. God swore that David's lineage would continue forever. So the failure of any king after him cannot and will not invalidate God's absolute oath to the lineage itself.
And the scope of this final fulfillment is made pretty clear in the oath itself.
Oh, yes. David would have a descendant ruling above the kings of the earth.
Not just among them.
No, definitively above them. This suggests a supreme universal dominion that just supersedes all other earthly authority and governance.
So all other governments will be under this way.
That's the idea. And what's more, the oath promises that even when the human descendants transgressed and faced punishment, losing the crown, getting exiled, God swore explicitly that he would not break or revoke the covenant itself.
So the temporary loss of the throne, the punishment, it only serves to highlight the unconditional nature of God's oath to the lineage.
That's it. The House of David's right to govern remains legally preserved, just waiting for the perfect heir. The failure of men only points to the fidelity of God.
And that's the mechanism that carries the promise through centuries of political darkness.
It has to be. The promise survives the Assyrian invasions, the Babylonian exile, centuries of Roman occupation, all because it rests on God's oath, not on Israel's obedience or their political success.
That clarity, that guarantee, it must have been so important for the faithful in Israel.
Absolutely.
I mean, when the average Israelite heard these promises of an eternal king, where did they turn to express that hope? Your sources point us to their liturgy.
To the songs they sang in the temple in their daily worship. The Psalms are just saturated with messianic expectation tied directly to the Davidic throne.
Let's look at Psalm 110. The source calls it a purely messianic psalm.
And it's a spectacular, forceful description of the future king.
It is. Psalm 110, the conquering Messiah, it shifts the focus pretty dramatically from, say, peaceful administration like Solomon to forceful governance and military strength. It anticipates the Messiah subjugating the nations of the earth to himself.
This is a rule that demands submission. It talks about the Lord's enemy being made the king's footstool. The source highlights that this is a clear prediction of his judgment of earthly kings and his rule that follows.
So it shows that the establishment of this political kingdom isn't some gentle diplomatic transition.
No, it involves the necessary, forceful overthrow of existing governmental structures and authorities that oppose God's will.
So we go from the administrative failure of human kings to a son of David who literally puts his enemies under his feet. That's a dramatic image. How does the source reconcile that shift in tone from a peaceful kingdom to a conquering rule?
The material suggests the contrast is there to highlight the difference between flawed human rule and perfect divine rule. Solomon's peace was temporary. It was earned through diplomacy and trade. The Messiah's rule is eternal, and it's achieved through divine, decisive conquest. The peaceful reign that the prophets talk about later is the result of this initial subjugation.
I see. So the rule that follows this conquest in Psalm 110 is one of unchallenged permanent authority.
And we see a similar focus on political establishment and geographical centering in the next psalm.
Psalm 2.
Right, Psalm 2, Installation on Zion. This psalm also speaks directly to the rebellion of unbelieving nations, these earthly powers that try to throw off the rule of Yahweh and his anointed one, the Messiah. They're scheming against divine authority.
And their defiance is met with a divine decree, not a negotiation. Yahweh installs Messiah on Zion, the holy mountain of Jerusalem, and from there, he will rule the earth.
And that anchors the whole political kingdom geographically. It puts it right back in the location of David's original capital. It's not some vague spiritual domain. It's from Jerusalem, the city of David, that this worldwide rule begins.
Which confirms the literal expectations that were tied to the covenant's original framework.
When you take the Psalms together, they portray a rule that is universal, it's centralized in Jerusalem, it's executed by a son of David, and it's achieved by removing all opposition.
The expectation is completely political and governmental. It lines up perfectly with those four literal elements we talked about: house, kingdom, throne, and forever.
And this framework of expectation, forged in the time of the kings and sung in the Psalms, is then carried forward and, I would say, dramatically amplified by the prophets.
Even when Israel's political reality was just absolutely collapsing around them.
Especially then. The prophetic books are so essential because they had to bridge this enormous theological gap between the eternal promises of towards Samuel 7 and the current political disaster of Israel.
Which was just rampant apostasy, civil war, foreign captivity.
A total mess. The fact that the prophets repeated the covenant promises under those circumstances says a lot about its non-conditional nature.
So let's talk about that unconditional nature. This is where that distinction we made earlier becomes so clear. The prophets are reiterating these promises of future fulfillment, while Israel is in the midst of continual sin and apostasy.
They're talking about the coming king while the temple is being destroyed, or while the people are already exiled in Babylon. The historical context suggests the unconditional nature of the Davidic covenant itself. Man's failure cannot and will not nullify God's promise to David.
The source material is careful to note those two levels of conditionality again.
It is. The promise to David had conditions for his immediate descendants, Solomon and the kings who followed about their personal enjoyment of the throne. Chastisement was possible,
Right.
but the covenant about the continuity of the line and the ultimate guaranteed rule of the Messiah, that remained absolute. That non-revocable promise is what the prophets hammered home when they needed to give hope to a people who were facing just utter despair.
Let's start with Isaiah. Governmental rule in righteousness. Isaiah prophesied during a time of extreme political instability, often warning about the coming Assyrian and Babylonian destruction.
But his gaze was fixed past that immediate crisis. He was looking to the coming king.
He spoke of the son who would be given, who would exercise a governmental rule on the throne of David.
And that phrase, governmental rule, the source highlights that as a key term. It signifies a structure. It's designed to enforce administration and order on a grand scale. The authority is political, the execution is governmental, and the king is divine.
And just as key, that governmental rule is defined by justice. Isaiah spoke of the justice of the Messiah's kingdom rule. The kings that existed then were corrupt, they were self-interested, often unjust. They led the nation to ruin.
But the future king would administer justice and equity perfectly on the earth. He would render judgment without prejudice. This directly connects the Messiah's authority, his throne, with his perfect action, his righteousness, as the administrator of a global kingdom.
So the prophetic vision acts as a corrective.
It does. The failure of Judah's kings, who were supposed to rule in righteousness, is contrasted with the guarantee that the final Davidic heir will establish the righteous administration that Israel failed to maintain.
Okay, moving forward in time to the age of the kingdom's actual destruction, we have Jeremiah, the righteous branch and tranquility.
Jeremiah's ministry was arguably the darkest in Israel's history. He watched the siege of Jerusalem, the total collapse of the kingdom of Judah.
And yet, right in the middle of all these warnings of judgment and total national ruin, he envisioned a future day of tranquility.
And that future tranquility is directly linked, once again, to the Davidic line. This is the day when a righteous branch of David, that's a classic messianic title,
signifying the remnant of the royal line.
Right. This branch would execute justice and righteousness on the earth. It's the righteous branch, the legitimate heir, who delivers the tranquility through perfect, just governance.
Jeremiah promised the continuation of the Davidic line, which would enable a descendant of David to fulfill this promise.
And the source stresses the legal technicality here. Even while the lineage was being uprooted from the land and all political authority had vanished, the divine assurance was that a legal royal line remained for the final fulfillment.
So the right to the throne of Israel, the legal house, was preserved in the genetic and legal record of David's descendants.
It's a tremendous act of grace. The promise of political restoration remains when all the political reality is gone, simply because God swore an oath.
Then we get to the despair of the exile itself with Ezekiel, the ruling David.
Right. Ezekiel was prophesying to the exiles who were already sitting in Babylon. They had lost everything. Temple, land, autonomy, king. They must have felt completely cut off from the promises of 2 Samuel 7.
And this is maybe the most forceful affirmation of the covenant's guarantee.
I think it is. The political kingdom was gone. It was over. Yet Ezekiel anticipated the fulfillment where David, and here it's used as a title for the Messiah, would rule over them.
And the context is so significant. This prophecy was given to a nation that had continually apostatized and was currently in captivity in Babylon for its sins.
It makes the promise stand out as just pure grace and unconditional guarantee. The restoration of the people is tied inseparably to the restoration of the rightful king.
So the expectation is clear. The future David is the key to Israel's corporate restoration. The nation will only get its true governmental identity, its kingdom, back when the Messiah, the true heir, finally takes the throne.
The covenant demands not just spiritual renewal, but a corresponding political structure to go with it.
And this consistent message is reaffirmed all over the place in the shorter prophecies too.
Yes, which shows its central place in Israel's theology. You see these minor prophet affirmations all pointing to the same thing. Hosea reaffirmed the covenant, looking toward a day when the people would return and seek David their king.
Amos reaffirmed it, linking the rebuilding of David's fallen tent, so the restoration of the collapsed dynasty, to the restoration of Israel and the submission of the nations,
tying the political structure to the expansion of dominion.
And Zechariah reaffirmed it, placing the Messiah's physical arrival and worldwide rule squarely back in Jerusalem.
tying the kingdom promise explicitly to the physical land, the city of Zion, where David's original throne was located.
So if we boil down all this prophetic testimony, the message is singular no matter the historical circumstance. The son of David will rule, politically and literally.
The consistency across centuries of prophecy, even through periods of total national collapse, establishes that the house, throne, kingdom, and its forever duration are absolute divine certainties.
Which brings us to a summary, and what the hope of this whole monarchical era really was.
The historical trajectory of this era, as the source material lays it out, is one of, well, increasing human failure by the actual kings.
Set against increasing clarity about the promised, perfect, sovereign king.
Exactly. So the Old Testament expectation is totally crystallized by the time the prophetic period ends. The source summarizes it this way. The Old Testament proclaims a kingdom to be established on the earth by the Messiah, the son of David, as the sole heir of the Davidic covenant.
That governmental future is the core belief generated by these promises.
And why did they expect a physical kingdom instead of, say, a spiritual fulfillment in heaven or some kind of metaphor?
The source answers that directly.
It does. The Jews expected a kingdom like that because they took God literally at his word. A word which strongly and repeatedly confirmed the hopes and promises of the covenant with David. If God swore that the house, throne, and kingdom would endure forever in a literal sense, the only logical expectation is a literal earthly fulfillment.
So the idea of restoration is the key driving force here.
It is.
Which leads us to restoration through the Messiah. The Old Testament reveals man's alienation from God through sin. That's a catastrophic theme running from Genesis all the way through the moral failures of the kings.
But the monarchical era revealed God's action plan for permanently correcting this alienation. God will move to restore man from his subservience to sin. That's the spiritual necessity of the covenant.
And he'll do it through a specific political vehicle. The Messiah, a descendant of David.
This descendant will receive and execute the total package promised back in 2 Samuel 7.
God will eventually give the Messiah an earthly, political, and spiritual kingdom over Israel and the nations, and in that kingdom the Messiah will rule in righteousness.
It's conceived as a literal government, functioning from a physical throne in Jerusalem, wielding global political and spiritual authority, and administered by a single king from David's line.
And that synthesized hope represents the final correction to all the failures of human monarchy.
This is the ultimate governmental structure. The Davidic covenant guarantees that the political apparatus needed for true universal righteousness is already divinely decreed. It's just waiting for the installation of the perfect king to administer it.
A system of justice and tranquility, promised centuries before that government is finally established.
This analysis really clarifies how that lineage promise from Abraham all the way through David sets up a clear and defined trajectory.
A trajectory toward a literal governmental rule rooted in justice and righteousness.
It takes that expansive promise of a great nation and defines its final governing structure and the absolute identity of its king.
Which ensures that even when the physical throne was empty, the legal right to rule was unchangeably preserved in the dynasty.
My closing observation from this would be that the source materials really stress the critical consistency of this hope. Even the total national collapse of the exile and the centuries of silence after that could not shake the divine declaration that the right to rule would never be taken from David's family.
Nor would the necessity of a literal ruling kingdom be canceled out.
Right. The whole Old Testament narrative is waiting for the execution of this specific promise, which is anchored in the legal language of the covenant.
That leaves us with a provocative thought for you, the listener, to carry forward from this. This source material asserts a future, literal, political kingdom established by the Messiah in righteousness. So consider the staggering implication of justice being administered globally, without corruption or failure, by a singular righteous king who rules from a central physical throne. What does that global, perfect government look like when you compare it to the divided, often flawed governance structures we know today?
Thank you for sharing your sources with us for this deep dive. It was a fascinating look at the backbone of Old Testament theology.
We appreciate you trusting us with your research. Gather more sources for future deep dives, and we'll see you next time.